In the dim hum of a NATO transport plane, Maya Lair sits in the shadows, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on nothing. At 34, she's a ghost by choice, a former French Air Force commander now cloaked as a flight interpreter, her past buried beneath layers of guilt over a wingman's death. Once she was Fangbird too, a name that echoed through war zones, leading missions that saved lives while risking her own. Now she translates radio chatter for pilots who dismiss her as irrelevant, their smirks cutting deeper than they know. But when crisis strikes mid-flight, with the captain collapsing and panic seizing the cockpit, Maya's instincts awaken. The sky doesn't care about her secrets. It demands her strength. Will she rise to reclaim the commander she tried to forget? Or will the weight of her past keep her grounded forever? Join us to uncover Maya's story, a tale of quiet courage proving that heroes don't always wear their titles, but they always answer the call. Maya Lair, a former elite pilot turned translator, hides her past to escape guilt over a wingman's death. Mocked by Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Rossi, she sits quietly on a NATO flight. When Morrison collapses mid-flight and Rossi panics, Maya's instincts take over. She commandeers the plane, navigating a storm with precision, revealing her identity as Commander Fangbird. Air traffic controllers, including her former student Dubois, rally to guide her. Landing safely, Maya confronts her past, earning respect and a chance to train others. But what drove her to hide for so long? Subscribe to our channel for tales of unsung heroes like Maya, proving courage speaks loudest in crisis. Share your city in the comments and join our community celebrating quiet strength. Support our channel to keep these inspiring stories soaring. Let's honor those who command the sky. Maya Lair sat in the shadowed rear of the NATO transport aircraft, a silent figure cloaked in the kind of deliberate obscurity she'd perfected over the years. At 34, she moved through the world like a specter, unnoticed by choice, her presence reduced to the barest ripple in the lives of those around her. Her official title was flight interpreter, a role that demanded she bridge the linguistic gaps in coalition missions between the United States and Italy. Her duties were straightforward: translate the rapid-fire radio exchanges, clarify technical jargon, and fade into the background while the so-called experts handled the real work. To the crew, she was a peripheral necessity, like a spare tire stowed away until a crisis demanded it. They barely registered her existence, and when they did, it was with the kind of dismissive condescension reserved for someone they deemed inconsequential. Captain Morrison, the American pilot in command, tossed her the occasional kid with the careless arrogance of a man who never bothered to learn her name. His Italian co-pilot, Lieutenant Rossi, was no better. During the pre-flight briefing, Rossi had leaned toward Morrison, switching to Italian as if Maya were deaf to anything beyond her translator's headset. "If things go south," he'd muttered, his voice dripping with smug amusement, "let's hope that little translator doesn't try to touch anything critical." Maya's face remained a mask of neutrality, betraying none of the fluency that allowed her to catch every syllable. She'd learned long ago that revealing her full command of languages, French, English, Italian, and more, only invited unwanted attention. And attention led to questions. Questions led to her past. And her past was a door she'd bolted shut. What the crew couldn't know, was that Maya Lair wasn't just a translator. 5 years ago, she'd have been Commander Maya Lair of the French Air Force, leading the elite Alpha 3 squadron through high-stakes extraction missions in skies far more treacherous than this transport plane would ever see. She'd logged more combat flight hours than Morrison and Rossi combined, had orchestrated operations that would make their routine cargo runs look like training exercises. But that was before the mission that shattered her world. Before her wingman, Laurent Morrow, died in a fireball because of a call she'd made. The weight of that loss had crushed her, driving her to resign her commission and retreat into the anonymity of civilian life. She chose jobs like this one, close enough to the hum of aircraft to feel the familiar pulse of the sky, but far enough from the cockpit to avoid the burden of command. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now rode in the back of planes piloted by men who wouldn't have lasted a single minute in the missions she used to lead. Guilt, she'd learned, was a cruel architect. It built walls around your potential, convincing you that obscurity was safer than greatness, that you deserved the smallness you'd chosen. As the transport plane droned through the night, Maya's eyes caught details the crew overlooked. Morrison's hands, too quick to overcorrect during a pocket of turbulence, betrayed a lack of ease with the heavy aircraft he commanded. Rossi's incessant glances at the instrument panel weren't the mark of diligence, but a telltale sign of inexperience, a nervous tick that screamed uncertainty. When Rome's air traffic control crackled through with altitude instructions, Maya's trained ear caught the precise directive, flight level 310. But Morrison, distracted or overconfident, punched in 350 instead. She watched the flight path skew, the plane drifting toward restricted military airspace. Her pulse quickened, not out of fear, but from the muscle memory of a commander who knew the cost of small mistakes. Leaning forward, her voice calm but firm, she spoke up. "Captain, I believe Rome Control said flight level 310, not 350. Morrison shot her a glance, his irritation barely masked. "Thanks for the input, kid, but I've got this under control. Radio chatter can be tricky if you're not used to the lingo." His tone carried the weight of someone dismissing a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. Maya eased back into her seat, her correction delivered, her role fulfilled. She wasn't here to argue. If Morrison chose to ignore accurate information, that was his burden, not hers. But as the plane's trajectory continued to veer, the familiar itch of responsibility stirred within her. She'd spent years convincing herself she could stay on the sidelines, that she could let others carry the weight. Yet the sky had a way of pulling her back, reminding her who she'd once been. An hour into the flight, the atmosphere in the cockpit shifted abruptly. Morrison, mid-sentence, slumped forward, his body limp against the controls. The plane lurched, a sickening dip that sent a jolt through the cabin. Rossi's voice cracked with panic as he grabbed the yoke, his earlier arrogance evaporating. "Captain! Morrison, wake up!" But Morrison didn't stir. The cockpit's instruments blinked relentlessly, demanding decisions Rossi wasn't prepared to make. The crew's eyes darted to the back, landing on Maya, not with hope, but with desperation. The little translator they'd mocked was suddenly their only lifeline. Maya's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the clarity of instinct kicking in. She unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to the cockpit with a steadiness that belied the storm inside her. The ghost of Laurent Marot flickered in her mind, his laughter, his trust, his final moments. She'd vowed never to take the controls again, to never risk another life on her decisions. But the plane was losing altitude, and Rossi's trembling hands weren't going to save them. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "move aside." Rossi hesitated, his pride warring with his fear, but the urgency in her tone left no room for argument. He slid out of the seat and Maya took his place, her hands settling on the controls with a familiarity that felt like coming home. The cockpit was different from the fighters she'd flown, but the principles were the same. She scanned the instruments, her mind racing through checklists she hadn't touched in years. Altitude, heading, airspeed, every number told a story, and she read it with the fluency of someone who'd once lived it. "Rome Control, this is NATO Transport 472, she said into the radio, her voice steady. "We have a medical emergency. Pilot is unconscious, requesting IM mediate clearance to the nearest airfield." The voice on the other end crackled with surprise, then recognition. "Commander Lair, is that Maya?" It was Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois, her former student, now an approach controller in Corsica. The sound of his voice was a jolt, a reminder of the life she'd left behind. But there was no time for nostalgia. "Affirmative," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm taking control. Give me vectors to Bastia Paretta." Rossi stared, his earlier smugness replaced by something like awe. "Oi, you're a pilot?" he stammered. Maya didn't answer. Her focus was on the horizon, on the instruments, on the lives now resting in her hands. The guilt that had kept her grounded for years was still there, a heavy shadow, but it would have to wait. The sky didn't care about her past. It only cared about now. As she guided the plane toward a safe landing, the crew watched in stunned silence. When the wheels touched down in Bastia Paretta, the tension in the cabin broke like a dam. Colonel Beaumont, her former commanding officer, was waiting on the tarmac. His weathered face broke into a rare smile as he approached. "Welcome back, Commander," he said, his voice thick with pride. "The sky hasn't been the same without you." Maya stepped off the plane, her legs steady but her heart unsteady. She'd saved them all, But the ghost of Laurent Morrow lingered. She wasn't sure if she was ready to return to the life she'd abandoned. But for the first time in years, she felt the pull of the sky, whispering that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to fly again. Maya Lair sat in the dimly lit cabin of the NATO transport plane, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a mask of calm professionalism. She was a flight interpreter now, a role that demanded she blend into the background, translating rapid-fire radio chatter and technical jargon for pilots who rarely acknowledge her presence. But beneath that composed exterior, a different life simmered, a life she'd buried deep, one where she'd once worn the uniform of a French Air Force commander. That past felt like a shadow trailing her, always close, always waiting for a moment to step into the light. Captain Morrison, the American pilot in command, exuded a brash confidence that filled the cockpit like a storm cloud. His voice carried the weight of someone who believed he'd mastered the skies. "Watch this," he said, his tone dripping with self-assurance as he banked the plane sharply to the left, then right, in a series of showy maneuvers that served no purpose other than to stroke his ego. The plane tilted unnecessarily, the hum of the engine shifting as he pushed the aircraft through the pointless display. "See that kid?" he called back to Maya, his eyes glinting with pride. "That's 20 years of experience talking. Not something you pick up from flipping through pilot manuals." Lieutenant Rossi, the Italian co-pilot, chuckled from his seat, his laughter sharp and mocking. "In Italia, we have a saying," he said, his accent curling around the words. "Passengers should stay passengers. Some are born to soar through the skies. Others, they're meant to sit back, watch, and wonder." His smirk lingered, his gaze flicking toward Maya, as if daring her to respond. Maya's expression didn't falter. She kept her eyes forward, her lips pressed into a neutral line, but her fingers brushed against the faint scar on her palm, a jagged reminder of a night years ago when she'd dragged 3 NATO pilots from a burning helicopter, her hands bloodied and blistered under enemy fire. Morrison's 20 years of experience consisted of routine transport runs and carefully controlled training exercises. Maya's past held missions that still haunted her dreams, decisions that had cost lives, including that of her wingman, Laurent Morrow, who died following her orders. That weight never left her, no matter how far she tried to run from it. The real test came without warning, as tests often do. Over the Mediterranean, the sky turned hostile. Storm clouds, dark and churning, materialized faster than the weather reports had predicted, their edges jagged with the promise of turbulence. Morrison's bravado began to crack as he grappled with instrument-only flying, his hands hesitating over the controls. The radio crackled with urgency. "Rome control to NATO transport 77 Alpha," came the voice, rapid and clipped in Italian-accented English. "Requesting vector to avoid weather, maintain heading 270, descend to flight level 280. Morrison's response was sluggish, his voice betraying uncertainty. Copy that, Rome control," he said, but his fingers fumbled, reaching for the wrong controls. Maya watched, her pulse quickening as he prepared to turn the plane in the opposite direction of the instructed heading. Her training screamed at her to act, but she hesitated, her voice soft but firm. "Captain," she said, leaning forward slightly, "Rome control said maintain 270, not turn to 270. Morrison's face flushed a deep crimson, his pride stung. "I know what they said," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the engines. "I don't need a translator telling me how to fly my own damn plane. Stick to your paperwork and let the pilots handle the flying." Rossi, quick to pile on, muttered in Italian, "The little mouse thinks she's smarter than the cat. Maybe she should stick to words and leave the sky to those who know it." Maya said nothing, her jaw tight. She watched as Morrison, stubborn and flustered, input the wrong heading, steering the plane directly into the heart of the storm's worst turbulence. A part of her wanted to shout, to seize control, but guilt anchored her in place. Guilt over past decisions, past losses, the kind that made her question whether she deserved to take charge again. Then the turbulence hit, a violent jolt that felt like the sky itself had slammed into the aircraft. The plane shuddered, equipment rattling loose in the cabin. Lights flickered as the electrical system strained under the pressure. That's when Morrison's facade crumbled entirely. His breathing grew rapid, shallow gasps echoing in the cockpit. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool air circulating through the cabin. His hands, once so sure, trembled on the controls, his knuckles white. "Rossi," he gasped, his voice thin and desperate. "Something's wrong." Before Rossi could respond, Morrison slumped forward, his body collapsing against the control yoke, unconscious. The plane pitched downward, the nose dipping sharply as alarms blared in the cockpit. "Captain!" Rossi shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he grabbed Morrison's shoulders, shaking him. But the co-pilot froze, his training inadequate for the chaos unfolding. Flying solo through a storm while managing an incapacitated pilot was a scenario no simulator had prepared him for. His eyes darted wildly, searching for a solution he didn't have. Maya didn't think, she moved. Years of command training surged to the surface, reflexes honed by missions she'd tried to forget. In 3 strides, she was at the cockpit, her voice slicing through Rossi's panic like a blade. "Move," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. She grabbed Morrison's limp form, pulling him away from the controls with a strength that belied her unassuming frame. Rossi stared, stunned, as the quiet translator transformed before his eyes. This wasn't the woman who'd sat silently in the back, scribbling notes. This was someone who belonged in the pilot's seat. Maya's hands found the controls with a precision born of muscle memory, older than fear, older than doubt. She pulled the aircraft out of its dangerous dive, her movements steady and deliberate. Her eyes scanned the instruments, adjusting the heading to skirt the storm's worst edges. Reaching for the radio, her voice was calm, professional, unshaken. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she transmitted, each word clear and controlled. "This is NATO Transport 77 Alpha declaring an emergency. Captain incapacitated, requesting I immediate vector to nearest airfield and medical assistance." Rome Control responded instantly, their voice sharp with focus. "NATO 77 Alpha, state your position and souls on board." "Rome Control, this is NATO 77 Alpha," Maya replied, her tone unwavering. "Flight level 280, bearing 295 degrees, 15 nautical miles southeast of Corsica. 3 souls on board, requesting I immediate assistance." As she spoke, the storm raged outside, but Maya's hands remained steady, guiding the aircraft through the turbulence with the skill of someone who'd faced far worse. Rossi watched, his earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of awe and shame. The little mouse had become the one thing keeping them alive. And somewhere, deep within Maya, the shadow of her past stirred, not as a burden, but as a reminder of who she'd always been. The storm raged outside the cockpit, a chaotic swirl of wind and rain battering the aircraft, but inside an eerie calm had settled. The radio crackled, a momentary pause stretching exactly 5 seconds, each one heavy with anticipation. Then a voice broke through the static, sharp and authoritative. "NATO 77 Alpha, identify pilot in command." Maya Lair inhaled deeply, the weight of 5 years pressing against her chest. 5 years of burying her past, of shrinking herself into a role that demanded she be less than she was. She straightened in her seat, her voice steady despite the storm within. "Rome Control, this is Commander Maya L. Clerk, call sign Fangbird 2. I am assuming command of this aircraft." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the storm itself held its breath. The airwaves, moments ago buzzing with routine chatter, fell still. Then a new voice burst through, young and brimming with excitement, speaking rapid French before switching to English. "Commander Lair, Fangbird 2, this is Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois, Corsica Approach Control. You trained me at Salon de Provence in 2018. Maya's composed facade faltered for a split second. Dubois. She could still picture him, bright-eyed, quick to learn, one of her finest students. His enthusiasm had always been infectious, and now, hearing his voice across the years, a flicker of warmth broke through her guarded exterior. "Dubois, what are you doing at Corsica Approach?" she asked, her tone betraying a hint of fondness. "Transferred here 6 months ago, Commander," he replied, his excitement barely contained. "Ma'am, I can't believe it's you. We thought—" His voice cut off abruptly, aware of the dozens of ears that tuned in across the Mediterranean. Maya could sense the weight of his unspoken words, the rumors that had followed her self-imposed exile. "I'm here, Lieutenant," she said, her voice firm, redirecting the conversation to the task at hand. "I need vectors for an emergency landing." "Yes, ma'am, I am immediately," Dubois responded, his professionalism snapping back into place. "Corsica Petta, 20 nautical miles northeast. Runway 06. Winds light and variable. Emergency services are standing by. Commander, it's an honor to guide you home." The word home struck Maya like a gust of turbulence, raw and unexpected. For 5 years, she had drifted, untethered from the skies she once had commanded, from the life where her voice carried weight. She had hidden behind the role of a flight interpreter, repeating others' words, her own silenced. But now, with her hands steady on the controls and her voice slicing through the chaos, she felt something stir, a truth she couldn't outrun. You could turn your back on your calling, but it never turned its back on you. Beside her, Lieutenant Rossi stared, his earlier arrogance replaced by something akin to reverence. "Commander," he whispered, the word carrying a mix of disbelief and respect. "You're really a commander." Maya glanced at him, her eyes catching the young pilot who, just minutes ago, had dismissed her with a smirk. In his wide-eyed gaze, she saw a reflection of her younger self, eager, untested, blissfully unaware of the weight of command. She said softly, her voice tinged with both resolve and reflection. "But some things, it seems, you never stop being." The cockpit hummed with purpose as Maya's hands moved with practiced precision, guiding the aircraft through the storm. Rossi, who had mocked her earlier, now watched her every move, as if trying to reconcile the unassuming interpreter with the commander who had seized control when Captain Morrison collapsed. The sky itself seemed to listen, its earlier chaos yielding to her authority. Her voice wasn't just another transmission. It was the language of command, unmistakable and undeniable. The radio, which had been a cacophony of routine exchanges, went quiet as Maya's call sign, Fangbird 2, echoed through the air traffic control networks of Europe. From Rome to Paris, controllers paused mid-sentence, their chatter replaced by a reverent hush. Fangbird 2 wasn't just a call sign, it was a legend, whispered in hangars and control towers, tied to stories of daring missions and a commander who had vanished from the skies. Dubois' voice crackled through again, barely containing his excitement. "Commander, Corsica approach is rolling out the red carpet. Emergency services are standing by, but ma'am, the base commander wants to know if you need anything else. Anything at all." Maya's hands danced across the instrument panel, her movements mechanical yet precise, even as her mind waged a silent battle. The woman she had been, Commander Maya Lair, leader of Alpha 3 Squadron, clashed with the woman she had tried to become, the one who hid her scars and her call sign. "Negative, Corsica," she replied, her tone clipped. "Just vectors and clearance. This is a medical emergency, not a reunion." But the frequency refused to let her retreat. Voices she hadn't heard in years began to check in, each one carrying the weight of shared history. "Fangbird 2, this is London Control. Roger, your emergency status. All traffic cleared from your route." Another voice followed. "Fangbird 2, Madrid Control, confirming priority handling. Welcome back to the sky, Commander." The respect in their words was palpable, a chorus of recognition that spanned NATO airspace. Lieutenant Rossi, who had been silent since Maya took command, finally spoke, his voice tinged with awe and curiosity. "Commander, what exactly were you the commander of?" Maya kept her eyes fixed on the instruments, guiding the aircraft toward Corsica with unwavering focus. "Alpha 3 Squadron," she said, her voice steady but heavy with memory. "Search and rescue operations in hostile territory." "Search and rescue," Rossi repeated, his voice cracking slightly, as if the weight of her words had finally sunk in. "But you're flying like you've done this in a war zone." Maya didn't respond, her silence louder than any explanation. She had flown in war zones, had led missions where every decision carried the weight of lives. Some saved, some lost, like Laurent Morrow, her wingman, whose death still haunted her. But now wasn't the time for memories. Now was the time for action, for proving that the commander she had buried was still alive, still capable. As the aircraft descended toward Corsica, guided by Dubois's steady vectors, Maya felt the weight of her past and present converge. The storm outside was no match for the one within. But with every command she issued, every adjustment she made, she reclaimed a piece of herself. The sky had called her back, and she had answered, not as an interpreter, but as Fangbird 2, the commander she could never truly leave behind. Maya Lair's voice sliced through the tense air of the cockpit, carrying the weight of a past she'd buried deep, far from the sanitized pages of official reports. I've seen combat, she said, her words steady but edged with a rawness that hinted at unspoken scars. 17 covert extractions behind enemy lines, rescuing downed pilots, extracting captured intelligence officers, each mission a high-stakes dance with fate. Her squadron lived by a single unshakable rule: leave no one behind. They never failed. But the price of that perfect record had been steep, costing Maya everything she'd once held close. She didn't say that aloud. She didn't need to. Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois' voice came through the radio, calm and professional, yet warmed by the familiarity of their shared history. Commander, you're cleared for runway 06. Medical team's on standby for Captain Morrison. And ma'am, Colonel Beaumont's here. He's been monitoring the frequency. Maya's breath caught, a brief fracture in her composed exterior. Colonel Beaumont, her former commanding officer, the man who'd fought to keep her in the service after the accident that shattered her world. She'd walked away from him, from her squadron, from everything without so much as a farewell. Now his presence loomed like a ghost from her past, waiting on the tarmac below. A new voice crackled over the radio, rough and weathered, steeped in the authority of decades in command. Fangbird 2, this is Colonel Beaumont. It's good to hear your voice again, Maya. Colonel, she replied, her professionalism straining against a surge of emotion. Request permission to prioritize landing procedures, sir. Granted, Joe, he said, his tone softening, just enough to carry a hint of warmth. But we're having a conversation once you're on the ground. Maya guided the plane down with a precision that felt like muscle memory, the kind forged in the crucible of countless high-pressure missions. The landing was flawless, so smooth that Captain Morrison, slumped semi-conscious in the rear, barely shifted as the wheels met the runway. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it taxied toward the terminal, their lights cutting through the dusk. Maya's focus, though, was fixed on the figures waiting ahead. Colonel Beaumont stood at attention, his silver hair catching the fading light, his posture as resolute as ever despite the passage of time. Behind him, an honor guard of controllers and ground crew had assembled, a quiet tribute to the news that had spread like wildfire. The emergency flight was being piloted by none other than Maya Lair. As she shut down the engines, Lieutenant Rossi turned to her, his earlier arrogance replaced by something akin to reverence. Commander, I owe you an apology. We all do. The things I said earlier, you spoke based on what you knew. Maya interrupted, her hands moving through the post-flight checklist with automatic precision. That's not your fault. But we were so dismissive, Rossi insisted, his voice heavy with regret. So damn arrogant. Maya met his eyes for the first time since she'd taken control of the flight. Arrogance isn't the problem, Lieutenant. Ignorance is. You didn't know who I was because I chose to keep it that way. I let you assume I was just a translator because it was easier than explaining why a former squadron commander was working a desk job. Rossi's brow creased, his curiosity outweighing his guilt. Why were you? The question lingered as medics boarded, their movements swift and efficient as they attended to Captain Morrison. Maya watched them, her mind drifting to other aircraft, other rescues, moments where a single choice had meant the difference between life and death. 5 years ago, she said finally, her voice barely above a murmur, I made a decision that cost my wingman his life. Laurent Morrow, the best pilot I ever knew. He died because I sent him into a mission I should have taken myself. Rossi's face softened, the weight of her confession settling over him. What happened? We were extracting a NATO intelligence officer from Syria, she said, her hands still moving through the checklist, as if the routine could tether her to the present. It was supposed to be a clean op, but the intel was wrong. Enemy positions weren't where they were supposed to be. Laurent went in first and they were ready for him. Her voice grew quieter, each word a heavy stone. I could have aborted the mission, should have. But the officer we were pulling out had intel that could save lives. So I ordered Laurent to keep going. She paused, her hands steady but her gaze distant, lost in the memory. He got the officer out. saved his life, but he took ground fire on the way out. His plane went down 20 kilometers from our position. By the time we reached the crash site, her voice broke, trailing into silence. "I'm sorry," Rossi said softly, his words barely audible. "Laurent's family didn't blame me," she continued, her tone almost detached, as if recounting someone else's story. "Command didn't either. Hell, Laurent probably wouldn't have if he'd survived. But I blame myself, so I resigned my commission and took a job that let me stay close to aviation without the burden of command." Maya Lair gazed out the cockpit window, her hands steady on the controls, though her heart wrestled with a storm of memories. 5 years ago, she'd sworn never again to bear the crushing weight of life or death decisions for others. As a former French Air Force commander, she had carried that burden too long, and it had cost her dearly. Most painfully, the life of her wingman, Laurent Marot, lost on a mission she had ordered. Now she hid behind the role of a flight interpreter, cloaking her past in silence. But today, the skies had called her back, and she had answered. Captain Morrison, the American pilot, had been all bravado and sharp edges when the flight began, his overconfidence dismissing her as little more than a translator. But when he collapsed mid-flight, his body crumpling under a severe anxiety attack, the cockpit had become a crucible. Lieutenant Rossi, the Italian co-pilot, had mirrored Morrison's arrogance at first, his smug glances cutting her way as if she were an afterthought. Yet when panic seized him as the plane faltered, it was Maya who took command, her instincts overriding her self-imposed exile. The aircraft had responded to her touch like an old friend, and she'd guided it through the chaos, landing it safely on the tarmac of Corsica Air Base. Now, as she completed her post-flight procedures, Colonel Beaumont stood waiting outside the cockpit, his presence a quiet anchor. His patient gaze stirred something in her, a reminder of the leader she'd once been. "Today I had no choice," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling engines. Morrison was unconscious, Rossi was unraveling, and someone had to fly the plane. But the truth gnawed at her. She hadn't just flown to save herself. Her actions had saved everyone aboard. Lieutenant Rossi's voice broke her reverie. "That's not true," he said, his tone softer now, stripped of its earlier edge. "You saved all of us." Before she could respond, Colonel Beaumont's voice crackled through the open cabin door. "Maya, the medical team has Morrison stable. When you're ready, I'd like a few minutes." Maya took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. For 5 years, she'd run from command, from the responsibility that had once defined her, from the ghosts of decisions that had cost lives. But sitting in that cockpit, feeling the aircraft's pulse beneath her hands, hearing the familiar cadence of radio chatter and the respect in the voices that called her name, something had shifted. The fear of leading, the dread of failure, had loosened its grip. She wasn't running anymore. Stepping out of the aircraft, she straightened her spine and came to attention. "Colonel," she said, her voice steady. "Commander Maya, reporting, sir." Beaumont's face broke into a smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him since the days when she still wore her commander's wings. "Welcome home, Fangbird," he said, his voice warm with pride. "We've missed you." Behind him, a line of honor guards snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and unwavering. Not for the translator who had hidden in the shadows of transport planes, but for the commander who had never truly stopped being one. Maya returned their salute, her movements precise, and for the first time in 5 years, the gesture felt like it belonged to her. The debriefing room at Corsica Air Base was a time capsule, its walls steeped in memories Maya had spent years bearing. She sat across from Colonel Beaumont, the familiar setting pulling her back to a life she'd tried to leave behind. "Morrison is stable," Beaumont began, his tone measured. "Severe anxiety attack. He'll recover, but his flying days are done." Maya nodded, relief washing over her that everyone had walked away from the ordeal. "Now let's talk about you," Beaumont continued, leaning forward. "That was exceptional flying, Maya. You haven't lost a step." She shifted in her seat, the praise both warming and unsettling her. "I wasn't supposed to be flying at all," she said quietly. "I was hired as a translator." Beaumont's eyes held hers, unflinching. "Yet when the crisis hit, you became exactly what you were trained to be. What happened to the Maya who never doubted her capabilities?" Before she could answer, a knock interrupted them. Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois, the Corsica approach controller and her former student, appeared at the door. "Colonel, there's someone insisting on seeing Commander Lair." Moments later, Lieutenant Rossi stepped into the room, his posture no longer radiating the cocky assurance of the morning. Instead, he carried himself with the careful humility of someone who had been taught a hard lesson about assumptions. "Commander," Rossi said, standing at attention, his voice steady but laced with contrition. "I came to apologize properly. What I said earlier was inexcusable." Maya studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "You treated me as I presented myself, Lieutenant," she replied, her tone even. "I chose to be invisible." "That doesn't excuse our arrogance," Rossi countered. "You saved our lives after we dismissed you as irrelevant." He reached into his flight bag and pulled out a pair of polished pilot's wings, their gleam catching the light. "I want you to have these," he said, holding them out. "I don't deserve to wear them after today. You showed me what real flying looks like." Maya's gaze lingered on the wings, then lifted to meet Rossi's earnest expression. "Keep your wings, Lieutenant," she said softly. "You earned them. But remember that expertise doesn't always wear rank insignia." Her hand slipped into her pocket, closing around an object she had carried for 5 years. Her own commander's wings, tarnished but still marked with the insignia of Alpha 3 Squadron. She hadn't touched them since the day she resigned, but now as she drew them out, they felt heavier than ever. "These belong to someone who forgot that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice," she said, her voice steady as she pinned the wings to her flight suit for the first time in half a decade. The act was a quiet reclaiming, a step toward the self she had buried. "Maybe it's time I remembered." Colonel Beaumont's smile returned, warmer now. "Does this mean you're considering returning to active duty?" he asked, his tone hopeful but not pressing. Maya's eyes drifted to the window where aircraft sat on the tarmac, their sleek forms tended by ground crews performing maintenance with ritual precision. For 5 years, she had convinced herself that staying grounded was safer, that translation work was enough to keep her tethered to the world without risking the pain of command. But today had shattered that illusion. The skies had called her, and she had answered, not just to fly, but to lead. Her thoughts flickered to Laurent Marot, her wingman, whose memory had haunted her every day since his death. She had tried to honor him by stepping away, by refusing to risk another life under her command. But today, she saw the truth. Hiding from her nature didn't honor his sacrifice. It diminished the skills he had believed in, the ones he had died trusting. She turned back to Beaumont, her resolve hardening. "What would you have me do?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of a decision she was finally ready to make. "Train the next generation? Lead a squadron again?" The question hung in the air, not just a query but a commitment, to the skies, to her past, and to the future she could no longer deny. Under the vast Mediterranean sky, Maya Lair stood at a crossroads she never expected to face again. For 5 years, she had buried her past as a French Air Force commander, trading the cockpit for the quieter role of a flight interpreter. She had convinced herself that hiding her history would shield her from the crushing weight of responsibility, from the guilt that still haunted her over the loss of her wingman, Laurent Marot, who died under her command. She thought shrinking herself into invisibility would dull the pain of her mistakes. But the sky, it seemed, had other plans for her. It was a routine flight, or so it seemed, until Captain Morrison, the brash American pilot, collapsed midair, his overconfidence crumbling as his body failed him. In the co-pilot's seat, Lieutenant Rossi, an Italian officer whose arrogance matched Morrison's, froze in panic. The cockpit, once a place of controlled chaos, spiraled into a storm of uncertainty. Maya, seated in the back, didn't hesitate. Her instincts, honed by years of commanding the skies, surged to the surface. She wasn't just a translator in that moment. She was Commander Maya Lair, call sign Fangbird 2, and the lives of 3 people depended on her. Her voice cut through the static of the radio, steady and authoritative, as she took control. From London to Madrid, air traffic controllers recognized the timbre of her command, a frequency of competence that hadn't faded despite her years of self-imposed exile. She guided the plane to safety, her hands moving with the muscle memory of a leader who had never truly left the skirmish. Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois, the Corsica approach controller and her former student, was among those who heard her voice. His surprise was palpable, but so was his trust. He followed her lead, clearing the path for a safe landing. When the plane touched down, the weight of what had happened settled over Maya. She hadn't just saved a crew, she had reclaimed a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. Rossi, his earlier swagger replaced by a humbling awe, approached her with a newfound respect. He had dismissed her as irrelevant, a mere interpreter, but now he saw the truth. Real expertise doesn't shout or strut. It acts, quietly and decisively, when lives are on the line. Colonel Beaumont, her former commanding officer, was waiting for her on the tarmac. His eyes held a knowing glint, as if he had never doubted she would return to her calling. "You haven't lost a step, Maya," he said, his voice warm with pride. "The sky needs you. Come back. Be an instructor again. Teach pilots, like Rossi, the difference between confidence and competence." Maya glanced at Rossi, his eager expression mirroring the spark she had once seen in Laurent, potential waiting to be shaped. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't known in years: purpose. "One condition, she said firmly, no more secrets. If I'm training pilots, they need to know exactly who I am and why every lesson matters." Beaumont nodded. "Agreed. Welcome back to the sky, Commander." As they walked toward the hangar, Rossi fell into step beside her. "Commander," he said, his voice tentative but earnest, "could you teach me to fly like that?" Maya's lips curved into a smile, a wave of satisfaction washing over her. It was the feeling of passing on hard-earned knowledge to someone ready to learn. "First lesson starts now, Lieutenant," Maya said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Real flying isn't about showing off. It's about bringing everyone home safely, especially when the stakes are high." The Mediterranean sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Maya looked up, the endless expanse above her no longer a reminder of loss, but a canvas of possibility. For the first time in 5 years, she felt at home, not hiding in the shadows of someone else's aircraft, but standing tall, ready to teach others how to navigate the skies with wisdom, humility, and a quiet confidence that needed no fanfare. She had once believed that walking away from something you loved meant you could never return. She had thought hiding her past would protect her from the pain of failure, that trading command for translation would lighten the burden of responsibility. She had hoped that by making herself small, the guilt over Lauren's death would fade. But she was wrong. Lauren, with his infectious laugh, would have teased her for missing the obvious. You can't escape who you are. You can only run from who you think you should be. In the chaos of that flight, when Morrison collapsed and Rossi faltered, Maya didn't dwell on her resignation or her guilt. She thought only of the 3 lives depending on her to bring them home. In that moment, she wasn't a translator pretending to be ordinary. She was a pilot, doing what pilots do. The radio frequency had carried more than her voice. It had broadcast her identity, the one she had tried to silence but could never fully suppress. Rossi learned a hard lesson at 30,000 feet. Assumptions can be deadly. He discovered that the quiet woman he had overlooked held the skills that saved his life. More importantly, he learned that true expertise doesn't need to proclaim itself. It simply delivers when called upon. Maya, too, had learned something profound. We all carry abilities we sometimes hide, whether out of fear of responsibility, shame over past failures, or the comfort of being underestimated. But when crisis strips away our self-imposed limits, we find that the skills we thought were lost are merely dormant, waiting for the moment when pretending to be less than we are is no longer an option. Colonel Beaumont was right. Her instincts, her leadership, her years of training hadn't vanished. They had simply been waiting, like seeds in fertile soil, for the right conditions to grow again. Lauren used to say the sky didn't care about your fears or doubts. It only cared about what you did when it called. As Maya stood under the fading light, she realized she was done running. The sky had called her back, and she was ready to answer. Under the vast Mediterranean sky, Maya Lair stood at a crossroads she never expected to face again. For 5 years, she had buried her past as a French Air Force commander, trading the cockpit for the quieter role of a flight interpreter. She had convinced herself that hiding her history would shield her from the crushing weight of responsibility, from the guilt that still haunted her over the loss of her wingman, Laurent Marot, who died under her command. She thought shrinking herself into invisibility would dull the pain of her mistakes. But the sky, it seemed, had other plans for her. It was a routine flight, or so it seemed, until Captain Morrison, the brash American pilot, collapsed midair, his overconfidence crumbling as his body failed him. In the co-pilot's seat, Lieutenant Rossi, an Italian officer whose arrogance matched Morrison's, froze in panic. The cockpit, once a place of controlled chaos, spiraled into a storm of uncertainty. Maya, seated in the back, didn't hesitate. Her instincts, honed by years of commanding the skies, surged to the surface. She wasn't just a translator in that moment. She was Commander Maya Lair, call sign Fangbird 2, and the lives of 3 people depended on her. Her voice cut through the static of the radio, steady and authoritative, as she took control. From London to Madrid, air traffic controllers recognized the timbre of her command, a frequency of competence that hadn't faded despite her years of self-imposed exile. She guided the plane to safety, her hands moving with the muscle memory of a leader who had never truly left the sky. Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois, the Corsica approach controller and her former student, was among those who heard her voice. His surprise was palpable, but so was his trust. He followed her lead, clearing the path for a safe landing. When the plane touched down, the weight of what had happened settled over Maya. She hadn't just saved a crew, she had reclaimed a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. Rossi, his earlier swagger replaced by a humbling awe, approached her with a newfound respect. He had dismissed her as irrelevant, a mere interpreter, but now he saw the truth. Real expertise doesn't shout or strut. It acts, quietly and decisively, when lives are on the line. Colonel Beaumont, her former commanding officer, was waiting for her on the tarmac. His eyes held a knowing glint, as if he had never doubted she would return to her calling. "You haven't lost a step, Maya," he said, his voice warm with pride. "The sky needs you. Come back. Be an instructor again. Teach pilots like Rossi the difference between confidence and competence." Maya glanced at Rossi, his eager expression mirroring the spark she had once seen in Laurent. Potential waiting to be shaped. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't known in years, purpose. "One condition," she said firmly. "No more secrets. If I'm training pilots, they need to know exactly who I am and why every lesson matters." Beaumont nodded. "Agreed. Welcome back to the sky, Commander." As they walked toward the hangar, Rossi fell into step beside her. "Commander," he said, his voice tentative but earnest, "could you teach me to fly like that?" Maya's lips curved into a smile, a wave of satisfaction washing over her. It was the feeling of passing on hard-earned knowledge to someone ready to learn. "First lesson starts now, Lieutenant," she said. "Real flying isn't about showing off. It's about bringing everyone home safely, especially when the stakes are high." The Mediterranean sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Maya looked up, the endless expanse above her no longer a reminder of loss but a canvas of possibility. For the first time in 5 years, she felt at home, not hiding in the shadows of someone else's aircraft, but standing tall, ready to teach others how to navigate the skies with wisdom, humility, and a quiet confidence that needed no fanfare. She had once believed that walking away from something you loved meant you could never return. She had thought hiding her past would protect her from the pain of failure, that trading command for translation would lighten the burden of responsibility. She had hoped that by making herself small, the guilt over Lauren's death would fade. But she was wrong. Lauren, with his infectious laugh, would have teased her for missing the obvious. You can't escape who you are. You can only run from who you think you should be. In the chaos of that flight, when Morrison collapsed and Rossi faltered, Maya didn't dwell on her resignation or her guilt. She thought only of the 3 lives depending on her to bring them home. In that moment, she wasn't a translator pretending to be ordinary. She was a pilot, doing what pilots do. The radio frequency had carried more than her voice. It had broadcast her identity, the one she had tried to silence but could never fully suppress. Rossi learned a hard lesson at 30,000 feet. Assumptions can be deadly. He discovered that the quiet woman he had overlooked held the skills that saved his life. More importantly, he learned that true expertise doesn't need to proclaim itself. It simply delivers when called upon. Maya, too, had learned something profound. We all carry abilities we sometimes hide, whether out of fear of responsibility, shame over past failures, or the comfort of being underestimated. But when crisis strips away our self-imposed limits, we find that the skills we thought were lost are merely dormant, waiting for the moment when pretending to be less than we are is no longer an option. Colonel Beaumont was right. Her instincts, her leadership, her years of training hadn't vanished. They had simply been waiting, like seeds in fertile soil, for the right conditions to grow again. Laurent used to say the sky didn't care about your fears or doubts. It only cared about what you did when it called. As Maya stood under the fading light, she realized she was done running. The sky had called her back, and she was ready to answer. The cockpit hummed with the steady drone of the engines, a sound that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a pulse hammering against Maya Lair's chest. She sat in the jump seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes scanning the instruments with a precision she hadn't used in years. The role of flight interpreter was supposed to be simple: translate, clarify, keep the communication smooth between the pilots and air traffic control. But nothing about this flight felt simple. Not with Captain Morrison at the helm, his voice dripping with a smug certainty that grated against her nerves. He was American, brash, and entirely too comfortable, dismissing her input with a wave of his hand. "I've got this, sweetheart," he'd said earlier, his tone implying she was little more than a glorified secretary. Maya had bitten back a retort, her jaw tightening as she reminded herself to stay invisible. That was her life now, hiding in plain sight, her past buried beneath layers of carefully crafted anonymity. Beside Morrison, Lieutenant Rossi, the Italian co-pilot, wasn't much better. His arrogance was quieter, cloaked in a charming smile and a habit of leaning back in his seat as if he were lounging at a cafe in Rome rather than flying a commercial jet. He'd thrown a few condescending glances her way, his eyes lingering on her notepad as if questioning why she was even there. Maya had learned to ignore men like them. She'd faced worse in the French Air Force, where she'd once commanded squadrons. Her call sign, Fangbird 2, whispered with respect by those who knew her. But that was another life, one she'd walked away from after the mission that still haunted her dreams. Laurent Morrow, her wingman, had followed her orders without hesitation, and those orders had sent him to his death. The weight of that loss clung to her like a shadow, a constant reminder of why she'd chosen this quieter existence. The flight had been routine until the moment it wasn't. Morrison's voice faltered mid-sentence, his hand jerking toward his chest as he slumped forward, his face contorted in pain. The cockpit seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with panic. Rossi froze, his earlier swagger evaporating as he stared at the captain's limp form. "What the hell?" he stammered, his hands hovering uselessly over the controls. Maya's training kicked in before her conscious mind could catch up. She unbuckled her seatbelt and was at Morrison's side in an instant, her fingers checking his pulse, her voice steady as she called for the cabin crew. "He's having a heart attack," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Rossi's eyes widened, but he didn't move. "Do something," he snapped, his voice cracking with fear. "There's no time," Maya said, already pulling Morrison from the pilot's seat with a strength that surprised even her. She slid into his place, her hands finding the yoke with a familiarity that sent a jolt through her. The plane was drifting off course, the autopilot disengaged in the chaos. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear, every movement precise. She adjusted the heading, her eyes flicking between the instruments and the horizon. Rossi stared at her, his mouth slightly open, as if seeing her for the first time. You know how to fly this?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and desperation. "Focus, Lieutenant," she said sharply, her old commander's tone slipping through. "Get on the radio, now." Rossi scrambled to comply, his hands shaking as he contacted air traffic control. The voice that crackled through the headset was one Maya hadn't heard in years, yet it was as familiar as her own. Lieutenant Jean-Luc Dubois, now a Corsica approach controller, had been her student in the Air Force, a young pilot who'd hung on her every word. "Flight 214, this is Corsica Tower," he said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "State your emergency." Maya didn't hesitate. "Corsica Tower, this is Flight 214. Captain's down, medical emergency. I've taken control. requesting immediate clearance for an emergency landing. There was a pause, and she could almost feel Jean-Luc's shock through the radio. "Commander Clerk," he said, using her old name, her real name, Mila Clerk. She didn't correct him. There was no time to dwell on the past, not when lives depended on her. "Affirmative," she said. "Clear the runway." Jean-Luc's voice steadied, and she could hear the trust in it, the same trust he'd shown when she taught him how to navigate a storm. "Runway 27, cleared for landing. Winds 230 at 15 knots. You have got this, Fangbird 2. The use of her call sign sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of who she'd been, who she still was, deep down. She didn't respond, her focus locked on the approach. The plane responded to her touch like an old friend. The controls familiar, despite the years she'd spent running from them. Rossi watched her in silence, his earlier arrogance replaced by something akin to awe. He followed her instructions without question now, relaying information to the cabin crew and coordinating with Jean-Luc. The descent was textbook, every adjustment calculated, every decision made with the confidence of someone who'd flown through worse. As the wheels touched down on the runway, the cabin erupted in applause, but Maya barely heard it. Her hands lingered on the yoke, her breath steadying as the reality of what she'd done settled in. She'd saved them, both of them. The aftermath was a blur. Paramedics rushed Morrison to the hospital, and the crew was debriefed. Maya slipped away from the case, her heart still racing, when a familiar figure approached. Colonel Beaumont, her former commanding officer, stood before her, his eyes crinkling with a mix of pride and relief. "Mila," he said, his voice warm, "welcome back." She wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't back, that she was still just an interpreter. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she'd built around her past. As she stood on the tarmac, the weight of Laurent's death still lingered, but it was joined by something new, a sense of purpose, of belonging. She wasn't just a translator, hiding from her mistakes. She was Commander Mila Clerk, Fangbird 2, and she'd never stop being that person. The sky didn't care about her guilt or her titles. It only demanded respect for its power. And today, she'd proven she still understood that. Rossi approached her later, his head bowed slightly. "I misjudged you," he said, his voice soft with newfound respect. "You're incredible." She nodded, offering a small smile, but her mind was elsewhere, already turning toward the future. She wasn't done with the sky. Not yet. And as she walked away, her hands still tingling with the memory of the controls, she knew she was exactly where she belonged, teaching others that true skill didn't need permission to shine, that the quietest person in the room could carry the loudest courage. Her hands, it seemed, had never forgotten how to hold the sky.